Hello and welcome to At Home with Ted. My name is Heather, Ted's lovely partner, spouse, confidant, sweetheart. I'll just say it all. I'm not sure if he agrees. But today we're doing our COVID special where we do Q&As. I hardly know anything about music, and for some of you who know Ted, he pretty much knows a whole lot about music. So as we've been hanging out, I've been learning a lot, and I find there's a lot of information, some that I glaze over and others that I'm like, wow, that's pretty cool. So just wanted to share his beautiful music geeky nerdy status, to pick his brain. And if you ever have any questions, please do reach out to us and we will ask Ted. So welcome, Ted.
Thank you.
Thank you for for joining us. And this topic for today is Miles Davis. Now, if anybody of you friends of Ted know Ted, he loves Miles Davis. And again, he's cool. I've heard of Miles Davis, had no idea, don't exactly know entirely what makes, Ted's, that this guy is one of Ted's favorites. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Ted. Why Miles?
That's a big question, and thank you, lovely wife and friend and all those things you mentioned. The thing I think that's interesting about Miles Davis, and I find this is something I find attractive in a lot of the arts and figures in a lot of the arts, is he had such a long and varied career and changed the direction of what he was doing so often. A really short trajectory is he was from East St. Louis, that he moved to New York basically to follow Charlie Parker around, and eventually played in Parker's band. Charlie Parker was sort of the main figure in the bebop movement in the 40s. So Miles Davis played with him, and then after that basically set out on his own as a leader. And for the next, how many years was that? Like 40 some years, went through all these different types of musical environments. At first it was sort of coming out of what Charlie Parker was doing in bebop, and then very quickly changed. One of the things Miles Davis was interested in is what happened in the bebop movement is music had started having more and more chord changes in it, more chords, as a device for and a challenge for musicians to be able to solo over. And what eventually Miles Davis was part of the movement to do was then after a while start using less chords, and you had to approach the music differently, and it gave you more freedom in some certain ways. His most famous album, Kind of Blue, would be an example of modal playing. If you examine a lot of the tunes on that recording, they don't have a ton of chord changes. He was also a band leader for a long time. He was a great discoverer of talent. You could just go on and on. I remember one time at a camp I was teaching at, Jim Vivian, my great friend and bass player, just had this, sort of gave a seminar to the students on all roads lead to Miles. And he basically said, take any, side person who worked with Miles and look at their career afterwards, and it takes you to all these different places. And also, I think it's important to remember, he was also, Miles was very early in on the fusion movement, which basically means sort of using rock textures and instruments and electric sound to play music. He took a lot of flack for that. And I think that's the other thing that happens with artists a lot, is that they'll do something that people love, and then people want them to keep doing it forever. But he wanted to keep moving and exploring different things. I think that's a feature of most of his music. Ask me another question, because I lost my train of thought.
No problem. That's awesome. Already questions are coming to mind as you're sharing that. Thank you. So just if you can just quickly give me like sort of his age when he started really working with Charlie Parker, and sort of that time period of where he's at in like what decades and all of that.
Sure. I think when he started working with Charlie Parker, he wasn't very old. He was going to Juilliard briefly in New York, the famous classical music school. So I think he was probably late teens, early 20s. I should know this better. And it's worth noting too, after his time with Charlie Parker, he really was never somebody's side person again. He was a leader most of the time. There are very rare occurrences you can find him playing on other people's records, but hardly at all. He was the one setting the direction. And again, he was a great spotter of talents, sometimes a stealer of talent when somebody else spotted the talent first. There's lots of stories of that. There's and that's an interesting point too. There's lots of examples of things that seem a little deceptive that he did. There's a lot of compositions that are credited to him that is generally known they probably weren't his.
So let's get into that in a bit,
Okay.
but just sort of what decades was his time span?
Well, so he was playing with Charlie Parker. I think that was the late 40s. Then his own career started from the early 50s to he died in 91 and pretty well performed right till the end. And during it too, he had a lot of issues with drug addiction amongst other things, which sidelined him a bit early on in his career too.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just looking at social context and so forth. And what struck me as interesting too is he was going into classical music first, and then he shifted out of that. And so do you know anything about his childhood, of what led him to doing classical music or going to that school, or if you can share a little bit about that?
Sure. Miles Davis's father was apparently sort of the most successful Black dentist in East St. Louis. So unlike a lot of people in that time period, they were fairly well off. His family had horses and things like that. So, I mean, he certainly, I think, lived a fairly comfortable middle-class existence as a young person. I think possibly the reason he went to Juilliard was because his upwardly mobile parents, and I think especially for people of color, being upwardly mobile was important, that he was going to the classical school. I don't even think he was, I get the impression when I'm reading his autobiography and things like that he wasn't even that interested in it, but it was a way to get him to New York to follow Charlie Parker around. He had met Parker because he'd come through town with a band to East St. Louis from New York, and Miles wanted to leave and join that band right away, and I think he was 17 or something, and his parents said, no way. And so this was the quickest and probably easiest way of getting support from his parents and then being able to follow the music around.
Wow. Okay. So thank you. It's like I'm learning so much already, and there's aspects of it when Ted talks about chords and harmonies and all this stuff. I know I am like blanked, but anyways, but I know for some of you who love music, that'll make sense to you. But I tend to link the social context and the backgrounds of people's lives. What I'm curious about is, why are you like what he's a trumpet player, you're a drummer. Why are you particularly drawn to Miles? You being a drummer and in jazz and experimental, and I understand those aspects. But yeah, if you can just explain more, like why are you particularly drawn as a musician towards him?
Sure, and I would say one of the things is that throughout his career, some of the best and most visionary musicians played with him. So I remember in high school, for example, one of the first recordings I'd heard of Miles Davis that I found out who it was, and it had a huge impact on me, as I went over to a friend's place and he played the tune 7 Steps to Heaven. Now, the studio version of that tune is an early recording of Miles Davis playing with the great drummer Tony Williams, who to this day is one of my favorites, who was, I think, 17 at the time. And in the recording of that tune, Tony Williams plays one chorus one time through the tune, plays a solo. It's quite a spectacular solo, for one thing. And the tune itself I really like. So I remember thinking, that's a really cool tune and that's a really cool drum solo. And I think that's what started the whole thing. Is I thought, oh, well, I wonder whatever the recordings are of this band. And what tends to happen, I think, with Miles and with him having this long career is often people can enter the train at any point on the track, because some people might go, I love Charlie Parker. Oh, Miles Davis played with Charlie Parker. Oh, maybe I'll go forward and check that out. Oh, or somebody else might, I'm an electric bass player. I love Miles's electric music. Oh, he played music before that didn't even have my instrument on. Maybe I'll check that out. That's again the thing that Jim was talking about in terms of all roads lead to Miles. He leads you to a lot of different styles of music, even on things like pop music. I mean, there's a later recording where Sting is in a speaking role as a French policeman. You know, so there, and Daryl Jones, who played in that same particular Miles band, now plays with the Rolling Stones, replacing Bill Wyman. So the reach of someone like Miles is quite huge in modern music in general.
That's awesome. Thank you. Makes me want to listen to Miles more. Now, you also alluded to the fact that he, struggled with his own personal, we'll call it demons, addictions, challenges. And even my dog agrees.
Exactly. Keep going.
And there might be even questionable, character traits that I think you mentioned to me about Miles that makes it challenging. But yeah, what are some of, not to degrade Miles, but just to see the human aspect of maybe what he struggled with as in his own journey of fame or being a musician, and just his own, even as a journey as whether it's a black male doing different genres, like anything that you know around that would be interesting. If you can share any stories or perspectives.
Sure. I think that's an important part of his story, and something that is sort of unavoidable when talking about him. He's a complex character. I mean, the racism part is huge. He was at one of the high points of his career, playing at a club in New York, between sets having a cigarette, and a cop told him to leave, and he said, "That's my name on the marquee," and the cop ended up beating him up. And this is something that wouldn't happen to a white person at the same juncture in time. It's ridiculous. This is, an artist of the highest order, and he's still treated like that. And he was one of the first people to say that's not okay. He was a big part of that movement in the 60s of saying, you have to treat me better. I'm not here to entertain you. I'm trying to do something artistic. And there was a whole thing around that. Sometimes they made a big deal about that he would turn his back to the audience. And sometimes it's the trumpet is a directional instrument. So he said often he was just trying to hear the band better and communicate with the band. And also, the other thing that's interesting with Miles is he was very aware of the effect he had on Mystique he had. And you can see that sometimes too. It's like, oh, if you did that, it didn't hurt that it looked cool. But back to him too. I mean, and he had a lot of issues as a husband and father. I mean, I don't think those were his strengths. Let's put it that way. I mean, it's he was a complex character, and in the era we're living in, it's hard to reconcile that, because you are listening to somebody who was abusive and to his spouses, to his kids, again, a complex character, but the other side of that is he made so much beautiful music. It's a tricky one.
Yeah, and it sounds like he had a lot of pressure, and he didn't have. I don't even know where his parents are in all of this in his journey, but I would really wonder how much support he had, and the social times, right, in those contexts. So, and then any. You were saying you even had self-destructive habits, so you turned to a lot of drug and alcohol addiction and all of that. So so it's one of those things where it's so sad to see somebody so talented, in a place of self-destruction ultimately, and then hurting others for sure. Thanks, Ted. So if you turn your back on the audience while you're drumming, we'll just say it's like you talking to the band and not being rude or anything like that.
Well, if I turn my back to the audience while I'm drumming, it probably means I won't be playing the drums, which some people might like. because I'd be playing in the air. It doesn't work so well with the drums. You sort of, if the drums are facing the audience, you're probably facing the audience. So that's not so much of an issue.
Okay.
Okay.
Awesome. So just if you can give us 3 song titles that you would suggest. I know that would be hard,
Okay.
but for people to get a taste of Miles or some of these even different genres.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that, I mean, and no matter what I do, there's going to be stuff I left out. One thing I will leave out on purpose is Kind of Blue or any tunes from it, just because most people, that's the Miles Davis record they know, and it's an awesome record. It's a great part of his history, but it's only a really small part of the story. In fact, for that particular band, which I love, so that's his band of sort of the late 50s going into the early 60s, at least some elements of that band, because there were a lot of personnel changes in his band. I would probably go to a slightly earlier record like, let's see. Well, I would say there's a tune called A Lucha, AH-LEU-CHA, which is actually a Charlie Parker tune, ironically enough. And he's playing this great 50s quintet with John Coltrane. Sorry. Quintet? Yes. It's without Cannonball Adderley, with John Coltrane, Miles Davis are the front line, and then the rhythm section is Philly Joe Jones, Paul Chambers, and Red Garland. And it's a really, the other thing that I don't think Miles gets credit for is the great arrangements he has. This is a fairly simple tune. It's sort of a 32-bar tune. It's a fairly standard form. But what happens during the recording of it, and check it out as you're listening to it, is between each presentation of the A section, which is 8 bars long, then Philly Joe Jones basically plays the melody in between those sections. And that's outside of the form. It's such a cool idea, and Philly Joe Jones sounds so great. I know this is very drummer-centric, but that's the thing about Miles Davis. He really knew about finding great drummers. He had so many of them. And it's a really cool idea that freshens up the whole thing. It's one of those things that takes your ears by surprise, and you go, wait a minute, what's going on here? Are they trading in the beginning of the tune? What's going on? It's a great idea. So that would be 1. 2 would be, I think I'm going to have to go with the tune Nefertiti, which is a Wayne Shorter tune. This is a later version of Miles Davis's band with the great saxophonist who's still around, Wayne Shorter, and Tony Williams playing drums, Ron Carter playing bass, and Herbie Hancock playing piano. This is, again, a really interesting arrangement, because what happens is the horns, again, you need to listen to this, but what happens is the horns keep playing the melody over and over and over. So that's all they do is play the melody. And then it's like the rhythm section sort of solos underneath it. It's almost like if you were watching an image where the foreground was always the same and the backgrounds keep changing. It's like that Bugs Bunny cartoon when Daffy Duck is walking along and all these backgrounds keep changing. You know, he's dressed up like a farmer, and on this farm he had an igloo. What? You know, and that's sort of what's happening. Wayne Shorter and Miles Davis are on the farm, and then suddenly the rhythm section builds an igloo behind them. It's pretty cool. So
I trust you on that.
Yes. And then finally, and this is a long track, but I just think it's so great, and this is a great example of electric period, and actually is the image that we have on this particular podcast is from that album called Tribute to Jack Johnson, and that is we'll see what they have, if I remember the personnel. It's a very transitional band. It's a lot of people that didn't play wide with them that much, I don't think. Michael Henderson, the electric bass player, Billy Cobham, John McLaughlin, I think, is on this track. I might be wrong. I don't claim to have all this absolutely correct. And the saxophonist Steve Grossman. And it's just the meanest, baddest shuffle on earth. It's actually from a soundtrack about the great black prize fighter Jack Johnson. And apparently Miles, who was actually very interested in boxing, like a lot of African American men of his generation, started thinking about things like the jump rope and stuff, and started thinking about the shuffle rhythm.
Oh, cool!
It's badass. It is so badass. has.
That's awesome.
And even the way it starts, and this is a cool thing about a lot of Miles records, is it almost sounds like they're not even ready to start. Like they just hit record. So it even takes it a minute to get going. Like it's like they're trying to find the groove, and then it hits a slot, and then it's it's just amazing. It's a great piece of music. And I mean, for the three I've mentioned, I'm probably going to mention 300 more. So I would suggest, especially for people that maybe have just checked out one part of Miles's music, say you're listening to the Electric Period, like go back really far back where he was almost trying to play like a bebop player, like Dizzy Gillespie. It's fascinating. Or if you listen to the early stuff, listen to like the really late period when he's like playing Sydney Lauper tunes and stuff like that, really short tunes. It's fascinating because he's always at the center of it. It's so cool, that. And so thank you, my love.
Awesome, thank you, Ted. So you see, if you give Ted a question about music, you're gonna get a whole awesome, beautiful explanation. I honestly love learning so much about what you have to share. I mean, you could probably, for anyone who wants to have an aficionado, you could have like a whole evening of sharing the nuances, of it all. And then for the average person, half of this I don't understand still, but I love the level of enthusiasm. And thank you for your knowledge. And I know those who really appreciate this, just getting to know Ted more on this. So, listen to upcoming shows. We'll post some of the music on Ted's Facebook page of these pieces that he's recommending with Miles. And we're also going to do eventually ones about the Beatles, because Ted's also a Beatlemania guy. He's also like Stevie Wonder. Anyone else that we're going to do some? We'll probably, there'll be lots more. So you'll just keep tuning in and listening. Thank you so much. Subscribe to Ted's channel if you want to keep getting notifications whenever we're making an upload. We'll talk to you soon for another episode of At Home with Ted and Heather.